The second part of chapter 22. On the Monday morning at 9:15, Herbert went to the counting house to report himself, to look about him. I bore him company. He was to come away in an hour or two to attend me to Hammersmith, and I was to wait for him. It appeared that the eggs from which young insurers were hatched were incubated in dust and heat, like the eggs of ostriches, judging from the places to which their incipient giants repaired on a Monday morning. Nor did the counting house where Herbert assisted show in my eyes at all a good observatory, being a back second floor up a yard, of a grimy presence in all particulars, and with a look into another back second floor rather than a look out. I waited until it was noon, and then I went to the Royal Exchange, and I saw some dirty men sitting there under the bills about shipping, whom I took to be great merchants, though I couldn't understand why they should all be out of spirits. When Herbert came, we went and had lunch at a celebrated house, which I then quite venerated, but now believed to have been the most abject superstition in Europe, where I couldn't help noticing even then that there was much more gravy on the tablecloths and knives and waiters' clothes than in the steaks. This collation disposed of at a moderate price, considering the grease which was not charged for, we went back to Barnard's Inn and got my little portmanteau, and then took coach for Hammersmith. We arrived there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and had very little way to walk to Mr. Pocket's house. Lifting the latch of the gate, we passed directly into the little garden overlooking the river, where Mr. Pocket's children were playing about. And unless I deceive myself on a point where my interests or presuppositions are certainly not concerned, I saw that Mr. and Mrs. Pocket's children were not growing up, or being brought up, but were tumbling up. "Master Alick and Miss Jane," cried out one of the nurses to the children, "if you go a-bouncing up against them bushes, you'll fall into the river and be drowned, and what will your pa say then?" Mrs. Pocket was sitting on a garden chair under a tree reading, with her legs upon another garden chair, and Mrs. Pocket's 2 nursemaids were looking about them while the children played. "Mamma," said Herbert, "this is young Mr. Pip," upon which Mrs. Pocket received me with an appearance of amiable dignity. At the same time, the nurse who had called to the children picked up Mrs. Pocket's handkerchief and said, "If that don't make 6 times you've dropped it, mum," upon which Mrs. Pocket laughed and said, "Oh, thank you, Flopson," and settling herself in one chair only, resumed her book. Her countenance immediately assumed a knotted and intense expression, as if she had been reading for a week, but before she could have read half a dozen lines, she fixed her eyes upon me and said, "I hope your mamma is quite well." This unexpected inquiry put me into such a difficulty that I began saying in the absurdest way that if there had been such a person, I had no doubt that she would be quite well, and would have very much been obliged, and would have sent her compliments, when the nurse came to my rescue. "Well," she cried, picking up the pocket handkerchief, "if that don't make 7 times, what are you a-doing of, mum?" Mrs. Pocket received her property at first with a look of unutterable surprise, as she'd never seen it before, and then with a laugh of recognition, and said, "Oh, thank you, Flopson," and forgot me and went on reading. I found now I had leisure to count them. So I found that there were no fewer than 6 little Pockets present, in various stages of tumbling up. I had scarcely arrived at that total, when a 7th was heard, as in the region of the air, wailfully moaning. "Oh, if that ain't baby," said Flopson, appearing to think it most surprising. "Make haste Up the stairs, Millers. Millers, who was the other nurse, retired into the house, and by degrees the child's wailing was hushed and stopped, as if it were a young ventriloquist with something in its mouth. Mrs. Pocket read all the time, and I was curious to know what the book could be. We were waiting, I supposed, for Mr. Pocket to come out to us. At any rate, we waited there, and so I had an opportunity of observing a remarkable family phenomenon. Whensoever any of the children strayed near Mrs. Pocket in their play, they always tripped themselves up and tumbled over her, always very much to her momentary astonishment and their more enduring lamentation. I was at a loss to account for this surprising circumstance, and could not help giving my mind to speculations about it, until by and by Millers came down with the baby, which baby was handed to Flopson, which Flopson was handing it to Mrs. Pocket, when she too went fairly head foremost over Mrs. Pocket, baby and all, and was caught by Herbert and myself. "Gracious me, Flopson," said Mrs. Pocket, looking off her book for a moment, "everyone's tumbling." "Gracious you, Mum, indeed," returned Flopson, very red in the face. "What have you got there?" "I got here, Flopson?" asked Mrs. Pocket. "Why, if it ain't your footstool," cried Flopson. "And if you keep it under your skirts like that, who's to help tumbling? Here, take the baby, Mum. Give me your book." Mrs. Pocket acted on the advice, and inexpertly danced the infant a little in her lap while the other children played about it. This had lasted but a very short time when Mrs. Pocket issued summary orders that all should be taken inside into the house for a nap. Thus I made the second discovery on that first occasion, that the nurture of the little Pockets consisted of alternately tumbling up and lying down. Under these circumstances, when Flopson and Millers had got the children into the house like a little flock of sheep, and Mr. Pocket came out of it to make my acquaintance, I was not much surprised to find that Mr. Pocket was a gentleman with a rather perplexed expression on his face, and with his grey hair distorted on his head, as if he didn't quite see his way to putting anything straight.